Okay, you're streaming and you're recording.
Good. So let's call the meeting. This is the Tuesday, July 20th meeting of the Historic Review Board, called to order at 6:03 p.m. And our first item here is just a quick roll call. We'll run through all the folks who are on the call here. I'm Danny Schreiber. I'm chairman of the Historic Review Board. John, if you want to go next.
Yes, I am John Floyd. I'm a city staff member with the planning department.
And I just have an order. John Steele, you want to do next?
And the other John Steele, present.
And Rich
Nowacki, present. It's good to see all of you.
and Scott, I'm just going down the list of what I have in my order.
Yeah, Scott Irwin, pleasure to be here for another excellent meeting.
And David, you're the last on my list.
Yep. David Taylor, join the meeting.
Great. And so that means we have, if I'm correct, that means Tom Watton is absent. And does our council liaison not come to these types of meetings, or I don't know if they're a regular attendee or not? John, is that normal for them to not be here? I don't know how that works.
I would say not tonight. So
Okay.
they don't have to come every meeting, but so I think it's intermittent. Unless Lynn, you have some more background.
Yeah, he RSVP'd no to this meeting. He's forget the reason why now, but he's not in town, I think.
Okay.
Okay, well, we'll forgive him for that one. Then let's see, our next item on our list is public comment related to land use items not on the agenda.
There isn't any.
All right, moving on. Approval of draft meeting notes for June 15th, 2021. That was sent in the email from Linn on July 15th.
So for that, I would just like to add that my suggestion is historic signage or artwork. Just that little nuance there. If we could add that to the minutes, that'd be great.
That was you're talking about under the work section, session, you mean?
Sorry, I apologize. Yeah, so work session and third paragraph down.
And what was the verbiage you wanted to change it to?
Vice Chair Nowacki asked about an opportunity to create historic signage and artwork.
Oh, and artwork. Okay.
Yeah, just whatever we can do to tell a story.
Good. John, can we make that change?
Absolutely. So those changes will be reflected in the minutes, and we can submit a revised copy for your signature. So
perfect. Do we want to make a motion to approve with that change? Anyone?
Yeah, I'd move that we approve the minutes as amended.
I second.
That's John Steele seconds. Any discussion? All right, we'll move to a vote. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, so then we pass the draft meeting notes from June 15th, 2021. And now I have to go back and find my agenda again. There it is. Okay. Moving on. So work session today, historic review code update. Our first item is the memo to the HRB, and I will let John take over on that.
yes, great. Thank you very much. So I think tonight's somewhat of a convergence and a revival of a couple different chapters the HRB has been working on. So I think, as I laid out in my memo, the HRB last discussed changes to chapters 2 and 25 in the fall. And then a couple of months ago, the HRB talked about some changes to chapter 58. And I think I've gone back and I've made some further amendments based on HRB feedback. in each of these sections, and now I think we're here tonight to talk about them in their entirety. Now, given the fact that some time has passed, especially in regards to chapters 2 and 25, and your thinking may have changed a little bit, the HRB may or may not want to revise some of the previous feedback, but I think that's why we're here tonight, is to get something a little bit closer to something we can bring towards a public hearing and actually work towards the public outreach and getting this towards adoption. So I summarized the changes in my memo, just trying to outline the changes I've done. Hopefully those are consistent with your intent based upon previous feedback. And with the memo, I've also included a few excerpts from the Secretary of Interior standards. And so there was some questions back in the fall about why a particular word was used in one of the standards. And we can come to that perhaps once we get to that part of the code. It makes more sense to talk about the standards in context. So I think based upon our recent meetings to talk about this, it might be easier if we just go through chapter by chapter, line by line, in terms of that, unless you have any questions or topics you want to discuss ahead of time. Okay. So I think perhaps I would recommend perhaps we just move on chapter by chapter and maybe start with the definitions chapter. And I can talk about each of the changes, or we can perhaps only flag the changes that the board is interested in talking about, whichever your preference.
Why don't I like your idea of just going through the chapter by chapter and talking about what's been, I think, the changes, and then if we have any other questions we can bring up. And just
Okay.
for reference for everyone, this is on the email that was sent on July 15th. There's an attachment on there for chapter 2, Historic Development Code. So you may want to have that nearby for reference. Or John, is that something you could bring up on your screen? We can look
Actually,
at?
it certainly is. Actually, that would be easier as well. So,
Yeah.
so why
I have
don't
a split screen, but it's going to be hard to read anyway.
okay. Well, let's see here.
I mean, for the public as well, it'd be nice for them to
Good point.
see how we're
Absolutely.
doing.
Absolutely.
They could always see it on our website too, but
Okay.
perfect.
Well, for the YouTubers out there,
Yeah.
here we go. so I think
All
I'll
of our
have it on.
YouTube fans.
Absolutely. So I'll just start with chapter 2, and we'll go in order. So I think there are a number of definitions I've added here because the various sections of code were found to be potentially ambiguous, and the HRB found it desirable to add a little more clarity to these terms. And we can always come back to these later, but I just kind of wanted to go through these. I believe in chapter 25, there was a desire to clarify the standards applied to the exterior of the structure. And as I understand it, the HRB wanted the term exterior more defined. So I think the first definition here says exterior is defined as the outside portions of a structure, including the materials, equipment, and components which constitute the walls, roof, foundation, stairs, windows, doors, attached projections, and other external parts and features. So I think it may be overly lengthy, but we wanted to be specific about that. So I think other definitions, perhaps I could go through each one and then we can come back and talk about any you have questions about. Another standard was there are questions as to what terms like massing and scale actually meant. And so this isn't, I ranged around the internet looking at different sources, and this term seemed to be the most clear, but this can obviously be further refined, but massing would be defined as the perception of the general shape, form, and size of a building in 3 dimensions, not just its outline from a single perspective. So in this sense, it's 3-dimensional presence in the world. And we can obviously, we can come back to these once we get to the standard.
I like that definition. That's a very clear definition of some of the things we've had trouble with in the past of trying to figure out.
Excellent, thank you.
Okay.
And I think I found a similar source for its scale as well. And that's the proportions of a building in relation to its surroundings, or the proportional elements that demonstrate the size, materials, and style of buildings. And then I think also, and for the next definition, you'll notice that the code has a definition for primary facade, but doesn't distinguish between secondary facade, even though the term is used. So I just sort of added this term here, exterior wall not fronting the street, which is generally the opposite of primary facade. So on the court, so part of a historic resource where the main entry is located on a corner lot, each wall fronting the street shall be considered. So this was a thought on that one. And I think finally, I think in May, we talked about the definition for Western false front architecture. Based upon your feedback, I've pared it down slightly to the standard. And I'm curious if the HRB finds that this definition is generally workable, given the context of Chapter 58 for the design area.
Yeah, I like that. I think that's great, John.
Thank you.
All right, let's go back to the beginning and get picky.
Okay.
I recommend adding decking to the definition of exterior.
Decking as in porches or something like that, you mean, the front?
Yeah.
I think that'd be consistent with the other terminology there.
And that would be, all the columns and the rails and all that. Yeah.
Do we want to include railing as well, or is that just sort of given? So.
Well, a lot of them in this neighborhood, a lot of them have columns of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if you need, that's obviously the support of some.
Yeah, we've got the catch-all at the end, so I guess, we
Yeah.
don't need to be cover every potential thing sticking out of a house.
I just had a question. What would be an example of equipment? Like a yard tractor? What's equipment?
Like a doorbell or a light fixture, is that what you mean?
It could be that. It could be like an HVAC unit, or some sort of exhaust, perhaps. It's also kind of hard to tell because as technology advances, it could be a Tesla battery. So hard to say.
But this is something that would be outside visible if I walk by the house.
Correct.
I think the one challenge still with the scale definition, although it's not going to be defined in here, is, and we'll have to probably deal with it more in chapter 58 or 25, but the what is the scale? I mean, like, what's our percentage? We don't ever clearly define. I mean, it's obviously not going to be in this definitions, but it'll be later on. We still have the issue of it says it needs to be to scale, and we don't ever say what that to scale means. That's the problem we've had so many times, is that people say, well, our building is 150 times as big. Well, that's a scale, sure. That's a scale. It's not saying it's the same.
I believe the term is used in relationship to existing structures. So I think it's, as it going, once we get back to the standards in chapter 25, I believe it's this is in relationship to additions, where we talk about the new addition being in scale to the existing structure.
It's also, there's a part of the chapter that talks about the new homes, new structures,
Correct.
which I know there's not going to be a lot of them, but they need to be to scale of the surrounding homes. And that's a piece of debate we've had many times, is what does that mean? Does that mean it has to be the same height as, or lower than, or can it be taller than? What is the scale that we're going with?
Mhm.
And this definition does not in any way address that problem. It does not answer that problem. We're still the sale problem. We've had contractors come in and say, well, the house is 4 feet taller than any houses around it, so it's to scale.
Mhm.
And it's always, yeah. And a
Yeah.
lot of the neighbors have had issues with that, because then they end up getting this house that's that's looming over their existing
Mhm.
home. When I don't know if that was the intention of the law. I don't think it was. I don't think that was the intention of the law.
Yeah.
We wanted to have it subordinate to it, but that's not what
Mhm.
we say in here. So that maybe is something we deal with later on.
Okay. Well, I've written a note here on that, and I think we can perhaps put that on hold until we get to the actual standard. But I have a note to follow up on that. So.
I think,
Yes.
I was gonna say
Oh, I have a-
potentially,
Oh, everyone's like, John, do you want to go first? What do we do?
I was just gonna say, it says on scale, it says proportion of the building in relation to its surroundings. And I would certainly interpret surroundings as other houses.
Right. But what it doesn't say is the term we use to scale as almost a noun, I think, if I'm getting my grammar correct. In the other portion of the code, it says it needs to be to scale, but we're never saying what that percentage, what that scale number is. Is it
Okay.
25% larger? Is it 25% smaller? Is it equal to, subordinate and not subordinate? Although we do have the term subordinate, I know, in other parts of the code. But when we have the term scale and massing go together, it says it has to be on the scale and massing of other, other properties, but it doesn't say a number. It doesn't give us that hard, 25%, 15%, 100%. So we have had houses that have gone much bigger to the adjacent homes and dwarfed existing historic properties because it's 4 feet taller. And then I just remember that the contractor, when they built it, they said, well, it's only 4 feet taller. It's not that, it's the scale.
So if I hear you correctly, you prefer to have some sort of metric, perhaps.
It would be great. I don't know if it's here or elsewhere, somewhere, whether it's in chapter 2 or if it's in chapter 58 or 25, but it seems like that would really help clarify it for us to not have to make that judgment call.
Okay.
But okay, Scott, go ahead. Sorry.
Okay. I'm sorry. I didn't want to jump away from scale. I
Yep.
figured we were going to hit that later, so we're good for now on chapter 2.
You want to move your conversation over to when we talk about it again?
Oh, okay. That's fine. I look forward to that later.
Or
So
we're discussing scale now, so
we need to scale this portion down. Look, more of a formatting thing, because you said there was the primary and the primary facade and the secondary facade. And I was thinking, since those two things are so closely related, maybe we could format it differently, so they would be together. So you're like facade, primary, and then secondary. Just flip it, I guess.
That's an easy change, just a comma, basically. Yeah.
I'm all about that.
I thought about that as well. I thought perhaps we should agree on the terms first, and then we'll do the formatting's easy to change. So that's great. Excellent. Can't do that. So
there was something else that I spotted in this that I've never noticed before, and I know we've had this problem in the past. We've had a number of buildings that have collapsed and fallen because during the construction process, which seems to fall a little bit under the definition of demolition by neglect,
Okay.
because the homeowners have not chosen to put up safety measures. And actually, in most cases, it's not homeowners, it's been contractors. But, you know, in order to maintain wall structure, like, actually, I don't think any of you guys were on the board, but we had that house that took off the entire roof and then the walls fell in, and didn't realize that if you take off an entire roof, the walls are going to fall in. And they put nothing to retain that. So it was, and the house ended up being demolished by neglect. And that's not clear in this definition that could actually, I mean, it is actually kind of fits if you read it, because of they neglected to take care of the safety standards. I don't know if that actually helps the homeowners, but it may. But that is definitely something that, as we get into the other later chapters, that I think the board needs to definitely take up a conversation with, of putting some teeth behind it, because that has happened since I've lived here for 15 years. That has happened at least 3 occasions
Oh, wow.
where there's been accidental demolishing. And then then the homeowner or contractor gets the benefit of being able to build it from the scrap, you know, from the ground up. As it's almost a reward for them, because obviously they build it to match the existing house that was there, but they get to use all new materials, all new structures, all new wiring, all new insulation, all new piping. And I think in the end, I mean, they claim that it cost them more, but I wonder if it did.
Yeah. Okay, that's an easy fix. I think we can also coordinate with SHPO on that, in terms of maybe getting some language as well.
Yeah.
So
And again, I don't know if it goes here or if it goes later, but I noticed that it does fall under that neglect.
You know, I've personally seen cases where people have removed interior walls and then had the roof fall in and essentially demolish the structure. So
Yeah, that's exactly what happened. Yep.
Yeah. So
yeah, Scott had his hand up. Yep.
Yeah, and as a continuation of that, because we had this conversation before, and I raised the question of like, well, what kind of enforcement authority do we have? Can we, like the Bureau of Labor and Industries, ban contractors from working in Westland? Can we issue fines? You know, other things to you know, make sure that contractors are aware that there are penalties for not paying attention to these historic preservation steps. I presented that to the city attorney. He was in that meeting. He didn't get back to us, I guess.
Okay.
Low priority. That's fine.
Yeah. Which meeting was that? Because I've just come on in the last few months, so I've been going back to rewatch old meetings, but I may not have seen that one. Do you recall offhand, or I can search through? So.
Oh, that's fine. I mean, that was it right there. You know,
Okay.
I mean, I guess I was, you know, more lengthy, but I don't think it's worth digging for.
Okay. I think it was within the last. It was in 2021. I'm pretty sure. It feels like it was fairly recent. Maybe we were dealing with chapter.
It was definitely within the last year and a half. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I can track that down, but also I have the crux of the issue here. So, and that's something we can work on. So apologies for that for that oversight there. So.
I mean, it would seem so, not this board, but it would certainly seem so, because the city has the authority to stop work on projects, so they're not complying with criteria. So I would think the city would have some sort of authority to.
Yeah, we do have authority for stop work orders and to hold them to the approved plans. But I think it'd be good. It'd be good to have a broad idea about what's working out there in terms of enforcement, in terms of both rules as well as enforcement options. So.
And if I remember correctly, I think we had sent Darren off to talk to other cities to see what they were doing for similar. If I'm not mistaken, Scott might remember, but I thought we had asked him to go look up for other cities to see how they were dealing with those kind of issues within. And Tom's not here, but I remember Tom. We've always had this discussion that you get these homeowners who come back and said, "Oh, I took down all the wall, took off the roof and all the walls fell down. Oh, woe is me!" And we get sorry, feel bad for them, and then grant them permission to go and rebuild it. But in fact, where we should, I don't know if we have to put it in the code or put it somewhere that if this happens, it's your own fault, and you're going to have to, be penalized for it of some kind.
Mhm.
But Scott, don't you recall? I thought we had asked Darren to go and look and investigate how other cities were dealing with that subject. I thought that was part of our conversation at that same time you brought it up. But that might be helpful to see how other cities deal with it.
Yeah, I know. I mean, it's got a lot of, texture to it, because then it's like, are we gonna wanna, are they gonna wanna deal with these issues in municipal court? Have that potentially turn into its own form of, we just created our own litigation issues, So, that's legal implications, I think, definitely need to be investigated. But it'd be nice if we could do something, or at least like create a license to be able to be a contractor to do work within the historic district. And then, of course, if they do something like that where they're negligent in their efforts, and it's like, well, then we pull your license. I mean, it seems like that is I think that's probably the most enforceable thing we could do. It's pretty weak, but I mean, at least that's something I think we could do pretty easily, and it would hold up.
I always wonder if how much of it, the folks who always had their houses fall down, it's a one-time contractor, then they're gone. They seem to be like they're not regulars around here. It's not like it's Icon. Icon's real good at taking care of their properties. It seems like it's the other guys who are trying to pull little tricks. These guys come in fly by night. I wonder if it's more of a fine is a better way of doing it, or they don't.
Mhm.
Right. But what's the right dollar amount? High enough
Right.
that it
Yeah.
actually or encourages compliance, but not so high that they're like, oh, this is worth fighting in court over.
Mhm.
That's the fine line.
Okay, well, I will pick up on that research there. So come back next time. I'm sure places like Oregon City and Portland and Salem and other Ashland have all these similar issues. So,
Yeah.
Okay. So yep, I will I will do some coordination on that, and then provide like a summary response in the memo for the next meeting, in terms of options available here. So okay.
Any other notes from anyone on the chapter 2?
I just have a question which might be a little too fine point, but it says period of Western towns. Do we need to be specific enough to say American Western towns?
Probably would.
We are looking at duplicating the American West, not just the West.
Right.
Yeah, not the Canadian West or something else, So that yeah, it doesn't hurt. It only helps, I think. So that would be an easy add.
And then, of course, you get into anything west of the Mississippi or anything west of the Rockies.
We could add some years if you wanted to do that. I think that may provide a timeline. So
Yeah, I kind of
Yeah,
like
not bad,
that,
yeah.
to be fairly specific. I mean, not down to the day and minute, but
Mhm.
fairly specific. This is the time period that's relevant to the Willamette area.
Yeah, I definitely like that idea too, having a date range to nail it down.
because the code does reference, I believe, 1890 to 1910, but we could include that into the definition. So okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Okay. Any other questions on that, on the artistic style definition there? Okay, thank you very much. So, and we can always come back to this while we're in the other chapters and the terms come up. It's easy to come back to. So,
Good. Do you want to move on to chapter 25?
so I've got this pulled up here. Did you want me to just go through the changes I made most recently? Similar to, okay, so I can do that. Okay, so I think based upon my viewing of, I believe it was the November meeting where you last talked about chapter 25. I included this suggested clarification to the purpose statement. So just in terms of when the code is being interpreted, this would help to clarify the overall goal here. It's not just identify and protect, but to repair and maintain historic resources. So I think emphasis would be on the retention of historic material and not just identifying and protecting it. So I thought this seemed to be in style and consistent with the conversation. But happy to revisit if that's not consistent with your understanding there.
I like that.
Okay. Okay. I think moving on. And if there are other sections you've identified since then and you want to revisit, we can do that. I've gone through and there's a lot of capitalization here I've addressed. So just for consistency here. I did see notes about previous HRB direction to modify gutter and downspout designs. And this is based upon notes passed on to me by Darren. If this is still consistent with your desired direction, we can keep this change or we can revisit if you like, but essentially it would remove rectangular and OG, I believe it's pronounced, style downspouts and replace with half round or K-shaped.
I'll put my ignorance in for a second on gutter design.
Mhm.
What's the standard shape of the gutter? Isn't that rectangular?
There are various shapes of gutters out there, and perhaps this is something where I could return with some visual information, some visual examples.
The ones, I mean, I'm in a historic home. The ones in my home, I'm pretty darn sure they're rectangular. They're pretty much square bottom.
Mhm.
I don't think they have mine are old. They don't even have that, wavy shape. So I would be in violation as soon as we pass that.
So yeah, this section I should have clarified. This speaks to the exemptions, work that is exempted from historic design review. So I think in terms of this, is this an area that the HRB feels there is a need to change the patterns out there based upon what's currently allowed, or is this something you want to revisit again upon 6 months, year later?
So I guess what I would wonder is if you decide to put in a rectangular shaped gutter, would that mean that you would no longer be exempt?
Correct. So the change is if you wanted a rectangular gutter, you would have to come in for a design exemption. So
I personally don't like that idea. I don't know why we should.
yeah. So
Yeah.
I,
Because if you're,
What
the
was
old
the
rule
logic?
of like for like, makes it harder.
What was the logic on not allowing the rectangular on that list?
that's something that I would have to go back to the earlier meetings to actually review, and I believe that was probably the May meeting last year.
I mean, I'm okay
Yeah,
with
it's-
adding the half round in without removing the other things that have been historically on that list.
Yeah, I think so too, because I mean, rectangular seems like it would be historic anyway. So I'd probably be more in favor of just adding that half round, but leaving rectangular. And then OG, what's that again?
That is, probably should have pulled it up. I believe it's one of the curvier styles.
Oh, it's a
So
little point at the bottom.
yeah.
Same thing. If I could just imagine if someone already has that in their home.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a double curve with the elongate shape with an S.
Yeah.
elongated shape.
I believe there may have been a capacity issue with those in terms of their appropriateness or for this climate. However, I can come back with further analysis of the section for the next time if you want to talk about specific styles.
John, so is there another place in city code that requires or demands or gives that instructions on what gutters need to be? I mean, like, you know, for capacity outside the historic portion of it?
Outside the historic, I don't believe there is, but I don't know for certain offhand. It's something I would have to double check.
I mean, meaning you know, like a neighbor up the hill or somebody else in West Link can put in an OG then if they want to, but the historic district couldn't without review.
Correct. Were this change to go through, because under the current language, they you know, rectangular and OG are exempt.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, just I would be just in favor of leaving those there and adding half round.
Okay.
I don't think we really need to be reviewing everyone's gutters. I think there's more things to be concerned about, like, you know, scale and design styles, things like that of the greater structure.
Yeah. I agree.
Okay, unless there's any more comments on that, I'll move on to the next change, the next exemption. So right now, the current language is replacement of building material when required due to deterioration is exempted. My proposed change here would specify when such material is beyond repair. So someone they wouldn't have the exemption it would not just apply to deteriorated material. It would actually have to be beyond repair. And so the idea here is to drive people more towards preservation of existing material rather than just allowing them to swap out because it's slightly deteriorated. So I believe that's consistent with the last check-in on the HRB on this. And I've somewhat copied this theme throughout the other changes, and you'll see this as we go through the proposed draft. Okay.
I like that description. That's a good, subtle but good.
Okay.
Yeah, this is great, John.
Okay, thank you. Then I will move on, unless I hear anything else, to page 7, where the next change occurs. And this is under Class 1 historic design review. It's a slight clarification in that criteria 3 is that Class 1 design review is required for revised points of ingress egress to a site. I just wanted to clarify vehicular ingress and egress. So the idea being that if someone wanted to add a pathway or a sidewalk, or you know, between a door and the street, it would not be subject to design review. However, if the HRB felt that should be reviewed, we could leave that in there. I just thought this was more of a clarification rather than a change of position.
I'm not sure though, because we have a few historic homes that have in the front pathway the historic marker from the original homeowner. That's
Okay.
like we have one here in front of our house, and you know, it has the name of it. And I think what we've tried to do over the history is make sure that the neighbors don't go in there and rip those historic stones out with the imprints in order to change the path, because, well, you know, we just don't want them to be. We like to keep that little section of history. And I know some of the houses have relayed concrete or relayed paths, but then they've moved that historic stone to keep that demarcation, usually with review from the historic review board. But and I thought that's what that applied to, but of course we have code in there about vehicle ingress and egress already. That's kind of, you know, always has to go through the alley anyway. But
and chapter 25 just sort of applies beyond just the historic district. It goes, so there are other sections as well,
right,
other properties. But this is something I could easily remove. I just wanted to check in on the HRB's desired intent for this section.
Now, does that also mean if someone wanted to move their front door?
No, I believe this would be where a person
just the site.
enters or exits the site, which would be the property line, and not the structure itself.
But that would mean so people who live on a corner could all of a sudden have their entrance now go on, you know, the avenue or instead of the street, or the street instead of the avenue, if they wanted to
Mm-hmm.
shift it also without approval, right? That's what that's saying.
So I think so this here, this is a threshold for review.
Yeah.
So in terms of that, so I think with this change, it would only apply to your driveway essentially, whereas, you know, without the change, it's pretty expansive, and it can include either a new or an additional pathway or sidewalk connection to the site. This comes down to, does the HRB find that new pedestrian paths on site should be reviewed, and I just wanted to double check on that. Or if you want to think about that, that's something we could always think about for next time. But I wanted to put that out there. This isn't based upon previous feedback from the HRB. It was something that occurred to me as I was reviewing the code. And since the goal here is to create clear and objective standards, was to sort of clarify when this applies.
In the years I've been on the board, I've never had a case of anyone wanting to change the egress or ingress from their site. So I don't think it's ever happened. But the only place I could ever see that really being would be on a corner lot.
Hmm.
But Scott, did you have a question?
Oh, I was gonna say, I mean, keep the specific language with vehicular, but then maybe add, you know, by, or just say by path, you know, any path or driveway, um, or just straight up say by footpath or, you know, vehicular. So that way we are specifically saying, yeah, either way you come on, we should take a look at it so it doesn't do something odd. We don't want someone turning the whole front yard into a parking lot, right?
True.
Okay.
So, so item number 3, is that new? Is
Correct.
that bullet point new, the whole line?
So only the red part is new. So, but yeah,
Okay.
the language. This is a new topic for the HRB. So this has not been discussed previously.
So previously it just had ingress egress, but you're adding that vehicular just to contain it, to contain which ingress egress we're talking about.
Correct.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, personally, I don't know what affects a pedestrian path. You know, doesn't seem to be an issue for me, at least on someone's property. Like what they want to do with the path doesn't seem to be any cause for concern. But yeah, definitely a vehicular ingress egress seems like it would have more of an effect. You know, and even if we don't run into it a lot, I think the language should be there to respond if it does come up. That's my thought. What do you guys think?
I think the only danger that you run into, so I was particularly thinking of like corner lots, where we have some folks who have had, it'll change the look of the whole street if someone decides to no longer have their ingress on the avenue side and they all of a sudden change it on the other
Right.
side. Then all of a sudden the whole street changes, because then you could have a whole line of fences, you know, picket fences that have no gate on it because they've decided to move theirs to the side. And we may grant it, but at that point we have no control. They can just do that at willy-nilly whenever they want to
Right.
move it around. And again,
Yeah.
I haven't seen it happen, but it could. Somebody could decide that I'm just going to want to make my house go out, you know.
Yeah.
And there are a few homes in the neighborhood who have fairly undefined entrances and exits. Some of these old houses, you know, they have like 2 front doors. So they really could literally just decide that that's going to become my front door. Now that's going to become my front door. And, you know, change the historicness of their property. Of course, they obviously can't change the front door without approval. That's another code parts. But they could certainly start using it in different ways, which also would change the way that they could
Yeah, so in that case, do you want to say like points of ingress, egress to a site, including vehicular, so that vehicular doesn't like limit the definition of ingress, egress? Do you know what I mean? Like, but just flipping that around, we've expanded it versus limiting it.
If I could step in here, I think the existing language is pretty expansive, so we could just leave it as is. And I think it would address the concern about someone chasing the orientation on a corner lot, for example. So, but that would be my recommendation. But I think this is something the board has discretion on here. So.
So currently, if someone was going to change, the vehicular access on the property, that would come before us.
Correct. It would be a class 1 design review, so I believe that would be a staff level review. So it would trigger review by the city. So
I think it's good to leave the expansive
Yeah.
language in there, and that way, we don't have to worry about people getting all Dr. Seuss out there.
Yeah.
it's a good description. So okay. Sounds like there's consensus on that. So I'll let's see here. Move on to page 8. Where the next suggestion here would be just a little bit. So this section here are the application content requirements, and under section 4 here, the idea here would be to specify photographs of what. Yeah, I specify the content of the photographs here, just rather than someone could just take a picture of it from the street and call it good. They need to actually be a little more thorough in their documentation, so it's in the record. So I don't think it really changes the standard. It just clarifies the content here.
I like that addition. The only thing I was wondering on there that would be helpful, I know for us, and we've had this problem, and we were already talking about it with scale. When you're talking about scale and massing, is to include elevations as well as adjacent properties. And then it says structure, but that also means that there's not that many empty lots left, but I think there's only like 6 or so. But it would also include empty lots as well. It's not just structures. Someone doesn't get to pass that if they have no structure on the property. They still need to get a picture of the.
So I think that's good. I think it also creates like a record over time as well. And so I think if future board members or staff or the public want to dig through and see how this area has evolved, it could also potentially serve that function as well. Okay, so that's a good addition there on that one. So I think the next change is on page 10. And this comes under design standards applicable to historic resources. And there are some changes on the next few pages here. So this section A is standards for alterations and additions. And this comes in, this is where the definition for exterior comes into play. And so retention of original exterior construction. And so I think this was just to clarify that the public concern is with what's facing the public in terms of that. And so I believe this was based on feedback provided in May of last year or thereabouts.
So what that doesn't clarify to me is if someone wants to change all of the studs in their walls to metal studs, they could swap them all out from the inside as long as the outside looks the same, right? Is that what we're saying?
That's what this would do, correct? There may be good reason for that if there's structural if it's being compromised, but that is a concern. So it would be altering the original construction.
And the original materials, which early on in our chapter, we were trying, in the very beginning of this, we identified we want to maintain, protect, and identify, repair existing materials as much as possible. But in this case, we're giving them the pass to be able to put on all, I'm just metal studs or whatever the interior they wanted to do without approval at all, or is this just give them permission to seek approval for it?
Well, I think it would be difficult to replace a wall without actually demolishing it and then sort of rehanging everything else on the outside back onto it. So it's essentially that's a pretty extreme example. I mean, it kind of illustrates your point, but I think someone would really have to take down the wall to replace all the studs in it. So
yeah.
So
I mean, that'd be really expensive, so I don't think we have to
Mhm.
worry about that happening without being
Believe it or not,
necessary.
the reason I bring it up is this actually did happen. We had the house that fell down. They were trying to do that, and that's why it fell down. They
wow.
took the entire walls off. They took everything out because they were trying to replace. Apparently, it had no studs. Apparently, from what they understood, so they were trying to replace studs, and that's when the whole thing fell down. So they were trying to get away with it because they were allowed to
Wow.
do anything they wanted inside, and that's what made it oopsies fall down. Because as everyone knows logically, yes, if you take out the entire inside structure, there's nothing to hold it up. It's going to fall. But
Wow. So is this something where perhaps you wanted staff to do a little more research on this, to maybe put some boundaries on interior changes, some structural changes?
well, I just wonder when we say the word exterior and we've got it defined, now all of a sudden we give them that permission to do stupid things
Mm-hmm.
to
Perhaps
try to keep to the rules. When we just say original construction, we're not defining whether or not they have to maintain the studs or not, or
maybe clarify maybe like internal non-structural changes or exempt, or I'm not sure how to. I would want staff would want to sort of research this, but maybe address the structural elements of the building need to be maintained, or those changes come before the HRB or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to get semantics, but when you say we talk about walls, what defines the wall? Is the wall just the outside structure? Is the wall the stud and the outside structure? Is it the beams that supported the cross beams?
Okay.
And I'm not a construction person or a contractor
Okay.
or builder, but you wonder what does that mean by a wall? I mean, is it
Yeah.
literally the outside structure, the outside surface, or is that
Okay, well, I think if we go back to the definitions, and this is where the section is where the definition is probably best discussed, is in context of this conversation.
right?
And so we do say that the walls,
Right.
foundation, roof and foundation, and it talks about the components which constitute.
So that would probably define in our studs, right? The components which constitute the walls.
Correct, and perhaps there's a way to reference supporting elements or something. We'd want to think about how to approach it, but maybe there's a way to clarify that, or yeah, I'm seeing the issue here. So,
I like your thought, though. I like the direction you're headed. I'm thinking that's what we need.
and I'm sure this has been addressed by another jurisdiction. So
Yeah.
I can imagine we can probably find a solution and mirror that if it's working for them. So,
Well, I know, for example, like in Washington, D.C., they have similar walls where they have to save this exterior, and they go through extensive
mhm,
scaffolding to hold up literally just the outside facade and then replace the rest of it with all metal and construction. And it actually makes a very cool looking building, but I don't think that's what we want in our neighborhood.
yeah,
It's like a big giant sky rise with a Victorian front.
mhm. Yeah, I've seen those, and I'm not sure those are seen as best practice these days, but
Right.
it's an example of preserving something, but it doesn't really get to the intent.
Right.
So yeah. Um, So I have my notes here to look into that, into the structural aspects and really maybe tease that out. Is the HRB, I think that's consistent with what I'm hearing. Is any other thoughts by the HRB on this? So, okay. Okay, well, that's actually very helpful. So thank you. So I'll come back to that. So like turning the page to page 11, I apologize for this being so busy. Perhaps I should have broken it out into multiple pages here. So, so I think in terms of that, so I think the clarification here is retention of exterior historic material. I think staff will revisit this in light of our conversation just now, but it says, let's see here. So in terms of this, the changes here remove some ambiguity. So it says the proposed language would say removal or alteration of historic exterior materials and features shall be avoided during the construction of new additions or alterations. And then it would remove the words whenever possible. Deteriorated materials and architectural features shall be repaired rather than replaced. And so I think here, this sentence is being changed consistent with the purpose statement, and that it's adding clarity, and it says deteriorate, the material has to be beyond repair. And so, because the phrasing whenever possible is just so, there's such ambiguity in there. So,
I mean, it
so
just wasn't convenient.
correct,
Right.
correct, so I think the idea there is to create that clarity. And then it also removes similar language down here that in the event replacement of an existing feature is necessary, new materials shall match those of the original building. And so again, it removes to the extent possible, makes it a little more clear, and it goes on to say it should match those of the original building in terms of composition, design, color, texture, and other visual features. So yeah, so in terms of that, I think if someone doesn't want to replace it exactly, they can go through the design exception process. Okay. Unless there's comments on that, moving on to section 5 here. So differentiation of old from new, and I know there were some conversations by the HRB about this last time, and specifically is about the word differentiated. And so I have tried to create some clarity in here through the addition of some language here, and it would read alterations and additions shall be differentiated from the original buildings to avoid creating a false sense of history, and shall be compatible with the historic materials, features, size, scale, proportion, and massing to protect the integrity of the property. So I went to the Secretary of Interior standards. Differentiated is actually used in those standards. And the idea here is that a viewer, someone seeing the structure, should be able to tell what is the original historic building and what has been added on. And so the idea is that it's compatible, but that someone doesn't get a sense that, oh wow, this thing was huge to begin with, or it's all they don't have a false idea about what's the actual historic part versus what's the addition. And buildings evolve and grow, and obviously functions change, but it seems to be that the current best practice is to differentiate new from old. So and so I'm just curious if this addresses the concerns from 6 months ago, or if you're able to remember that back that far, or is there a new issue I'm not seeing? So, but
Is this, I just got to go back up. Is this only new construction, or is this in additions? This is only on additions. Okay.
oh, actually, this is for both additions and so this would apply to both additions and alterations.
Okay. So
So,
not for new construction.
correct.
I'm not sure what chapter we're at. Okay.
Correct.
I think this is a standard that's been kind of known in the neighborhood for a while. I know when we did our addition, we had to make it stand out.
Yeah.
So.
Okay. As I recall, I believe the term was differentiated caused some concern. But
I remember the discussion talking about that in the past, and it kind of went back and forth. And I know there's some neighbors who want it more differentiated, and then there's also that thing of, don't you want it to blend into the existing house? But
so I think through things like similar material, scale, you know, window patterns, you can make it complement very nicely. But the it could be anyway. So I think hopefully this addition helps a new user of the code understand what's being requested from them. So.
And then John, the these sheets here that have what's recommended and what's not recommended.
Yes.
Is that available to the public if someone's going through this code and they're like, okay, what does it mean to, have similar historic materials, features, etc., but also be differentiated?
Okay. So the materials I provide. So I provided an excerpt of materials available on the Secretary of Interior's website. And so yes, these are free to download. I don't recall if they're specifically referenced in our code, and so that's something that's a tie-in to the code.
I think that would be super useful just for the
Okay.
person that's dealing with this.
Mhm.
We could just reference that you can get this, because this really helps me. Like just this example right here with the roof line and stuff and the imagery to go along with it, especially because we're talking about a very visual thing, but we're representing it in code. So the more that we can kind of pair those together, I think it just helps the citizen.
Absolutely. If it's this is also an area where perhaps like some sort of example or exhibit or illustration could be inserted, where rather than reference an outside document, we could actually include it in here, if that's something you think would be helpful. So
Yeah, I do. Whatever we can do to illustrate it really helps.
okay.
So whatever's more efficient, whether you think it should be inserted or whether we link out.
Okay. I think we should be able to do that.
Awesome.
Okay. So any other questions or comments about this chapter, about this section? Hey, moving on to number 7 here. So this comes down to this section is specific to building additions, and the idea here is to create some clarifying language, and that current language reads, building additions shall be subordinate to the original building, smaller in scale and attached to the rear or setback along the side. However, there may be cases where there's a need or a desire or whatever to have an addition that has to be larger for whatever reason. And so the idea here would be to insert language that says where new additions must be larger, the new addition shall be articulated in such a manner that no single element is visually larger than the historic building or surrounding historic buildings. This could be, for example, I don't know, historic city hall, if there's something, a future addition, a home. There's any number of buildings out there, and trying to anticipate buildings that may be listed in the future, not just what's currently on the register. But I'm just curious if the HRB has any thoughts or comments about this addition.
I'm concerned about those words because it opens some ambiguity where right before we said it must be smaller in scale.
Okay.
And then all of a sudden we say, oh, but it may not be. But if it has to be larger, we're giving versus us giving, in the past, we have given variances. We have given, permission for other things. But I just don't like the idea of opening up the ambiguity. And I know when we have done that before, we have made sure that we put in the clarity that this is not a precedent setting decision to allow a house to have a higher roof line.
Okay.
I don't know. We've been pretty strict as an HRB on that one to not allow the changes in scale and massing to go beyond the home.
Yeah.
Although, as I say that with a big asterisk, we've always given waivers. So
Yeah, I agree. I think the position should not be to allow that except for, one-off here and there.
Okay, it's pretty clear. Any other thoughts or comments? Okay. I will remove that from the next draft. So the point.
Although, as I'm reading back to it, I'm wondering if you could always, you could keep the second portion of it. The new addition shall be articulated in such a manner that no single element is visually larger than the historic building or surrounded historic buildings. It's just that person provided where additions must be larger.
Oh, I see. Okay.
If you could keep that in there, that's clarification that if there ever is a waiver given,
Mhm.
or a variance or whatever we call it, that basically telling the future boards, no matter what, nothing should be visually larger.
Although I believe the first sentence may actually capture that, is that building additions shall be subordinate to the original building, smaller in scale,
True.
and attached to the rear and back. So,
But then isn't there some contradiction then though? If building additions should be subordinate and smaller in scale,
mhm.
then the next sentence where new additions must be larger, isn't that a contradiction to have those both there?
Yeah, that's what I was saying too, Rich.
Yep.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I could basically see everything staying as it is, but just
Mhm.
taking out where new additions must be larger.
Okay.
What I would suggest.
Okay. That's noted. So, okay. So I think moving on to number 10 here as well, since it sounds like we're done with number 7. So these changes here were, I believe these were consistent with previous conversations, and it basically says the new language would say replacement of the finished materials of existing walls and siding must be with building materials consistent with the original construction, and so it removes an option to replace with different materials. And so under the current language says replacement of the finished materials of existing walls and siding with different material must be demonstrated using photographic or other evidence to be in character with those of the original materials. So, and I kind of went this direction because I think back in previous conversations there was tracking with I think allowing cement fiber materials, and then I think the HRB may have changed your mind on that and decided no, to keep with actual historic materials, and then push people through a design exception. But I may have gotten this wrong, so I wanted to double check with you on that. So. And there's been some passage of time here on this. So.
So the original was included the photographic evidence. Basically, we're giving some
Yeah.
instructions on how to do it before, and we're just taking out those instructions.
Yeah. So before, basically you could replace with something of the time period, whereas now it would have to be only with the original construction. So it sort of keeps a building closer to its original design and not just with the time period necessarily. So
Original construction. Yeah, see, some of the challenges I think for some of that is some people have, asbestos siding on their house now
true.
over the original. So what do they want to replace it with? And I'm actually kind of, I don't know. I don't think anyone has aluminum in the neighborhood, but I think the only thing we have is some of that asbestos stuff left.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Or there may be people who have cedar over original clapboard or something.
Mhm. Well, I think this goes back to the original construction, which would be,
Right.
you know,
And that
so,
was already in there anyway.
yeah. Well, this is something we can mull over if you like. So,
But this doesn't exclude them from being able to ask if they can use a hardy plank or something, right? That's just, they just have
correct,
to get a variance.
correct. That is correct.
Okay.
Let's see here. Yeah, that would be like a design. It would be a modification process. So,
Yeah.
okay. Okay. Well, not hearing too much more feedback on that, so we'll. And again, this is just a workshop, so if we want to continue to do that, we can. So, in terms of this also comes back again to gutters and downspout language. So I think based on previous direction, we could just keep these styles and just add. Let me remind myself on the distinction between these two sections. Yeah, so in this case, this is just applies to the additions and alterations. So maybe perhaps based on previous direction, we would just add the new style as part of the acceptable list. But,
Yep.
okay. So moving on to page. Yeah, so I think actually at the bottom of page 12, I just wanted to check in with you on this, and this speaks to the repair or construction of foundations. And based on my notes here, previous discussion was to change this language under so repair or construction of a foundation that results in raising or lowering the building elevation must demonstrate that the proposal is consistent with the original design and, if applicable, is consistent in the context of adjacent and other structures on the block. And so I understand there's previous discussion to change the language to similar houses. However, there may be non-residential structures on the list at some point. So I just wanted to revisit with the HRB. Did you want to continue down the path of specifying similar houses, or perhaps keeping it to keep in this sort of expansive language here?
This is basically changing the word structures to dwellings. Is that what we're thinking?
Correct. That was
And that's to get rid of like garages being considered.
I believe so. Yeah. So you could say primary structures, but I think the idea was to keep. I think the idea here is to keep a consistent streetscape
Yeah.
elevations.
I'm okay with the word dwelling instead of houses, but whatever.
Okay. I think the existing language is consistent in the context of adjacent and other structures. So it doesn't actually specify dwellings, but I understand previous HRB conversation wanting to specify similar houses. And so this may be too far back to easily come to mind. So I apologize.
I'm thinking now, like, if there are other structures that end up being historic as well that are not dwellings,
Hmm.
then to me it seems like we'd still want them to match the same standards.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure if I would be in favor of the need to change that to dwellings. Because if there is, if the historic definition is potentially going to include other structures, I mean, I think whatever it's next to should all be grouped together.
So this is regarding foundations themselves, not the actual structure, but how the foundation is constructed. And I know some of like a shed may not have a good foundation that you'd want to build a house upon.
Yeah.
Or vice versa. And I think that's what this is trying to clarify, that adjacent, we're specifically talking about adjacent dwellings, right? We don't want someone building their house consistent with a shed.
Yeah. Typically speaking, that it's, on the register, it's typically the house that's on the register, and the sheds are often, sometimes it's an ensemble, but usually it's the house, and the sheds are usually dated much later. Or what I think the idea here is, maybe if there's a foundations being replaced, for example, on a home.
Right.
So, and this only kicks in if you're raising or lowering the building elevation.
Yeah.
So it's,
Yeah, I just personally don't think that's a mandatory change. If
Yeah.
we wanted to make that change, I wouldn't stand in the way. I personally doesn't stand out to me as something that's super important.
okay. Okay. Well, again, I appreciate that. I just have a note here from the past that this was talked about, and just wanted to, it seemed like something that may not be desirable, but okay, well, I'll think I have some feedback on that then, unless the board wants to talk about this further. Okay. So I think moving on to page 13 here. So I think under additional standards applicable to historic districts, and so I think alterations, and so in terms of this, there was previous discussion about removing this sentence, and so alterations and additions shall be compatible in scale and mass to adjacent properties, and construction in such a way that they maintain the privacy of the residents of adjacent properties through window placement, orientation, and landscaping. And so I think the question here in terms of this is that, does the HRB feel that the term scale and massing have been sufficiently defined to keep the standard, or did you want to still replace the sentence?
I think that was the intention was not to remove that sentence. The intention of the board, I think, was to better define scale and mass, so we know in the future, because that does kind of open up, like, deleting scale and mass kind of makes it sound as though they can build anything they want, as long as they maintain the privacy of the house next door. And I don't think that's in any way what our intention is.
No.
I think what we really want more of a better definition of what scale and mass is by putting a percentage or a number on it. But and I don't know if there is a national standard or a SHPO standard of what that scale and massing, should be. That's I think Darren may have slightly misinterpreted that comment.
Okay.
I don't think, I mean, unless someone else disagrees with me, I don't think we wanted to delete that at all.
Okay, well, having thought about this more in the last few minutes here, I have seen examples of metrics applied to how you define scale and sort of like a compatible scale and whatnot. So I think given our earlier conversations tonight, I can revisit the section based upon that direction.
I would love that, and that's
okay.
I've had that question for years of what
Okay.
that I didn't know if there's a national matrix, that'd be great to put that in there. I think that would be very helpful.
Okay. Anyone else? Or... Okay.
So I don't mind the creating of a, although it was B, was it a section, or we're deleting the subsection B is what we're trying to do, make it just.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
think
okay.
I think the intention here is to replace the sentence and to not and to provide more clarity to the standard and not remove it. And so
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to. If there's no other comments on this, I'll move on to standards for new construction, which we kind of touched upon earlier. I think the idea here would be to keep this largely as is, with one removal, in that in terms of standards for new construction, it would be to delete reference to lot or parcel size when we're talking about massing, scale, proportion, and other sort of compatibility standards for new and old, and that lot size is regulated elsewhere in the code. And so I think really the idea, the generally it's more the size of the new structures perhaps than the actual new lots, but I'm curious what the HRB feels about removing the section and just deferring to the base zone standards.
I think in previous cases we've just defaulted anyway to the actual percent, because isn't there a percentage somewhere else in the code of what they can fill in the lot and other things like that? And I thought there's more positioning stuff. I think we've just whenever we've had that decision, we did have that decision on Fifth Avenue where we actually ended up defeating. We followed the other code, just as you said.
Yes, yeah. There's the base zone standard, and then the historic standards layered on top.
Yeah.
So there'd be like, yeah, and the zoning is, the current zoning is fairly consistent with current lot sizes. So there's a, yeah. So
as well as the setbacks kind of help define that as well. There's all that kind of.
Correct. So between the base zone setbacks and then the dimensional standards and design guidelines here, I think lot size is not going to be a driving factor in terms of new development here. Okay. So I think moving on here to page 16 onto so this section is the Willamette Historic District General Design Standards, and these are setback and orientation, things like that. One question here was that is that right now residential structures are limited to 28 feet in height. So in terms of proportion and scale, in terms of the context for earlier conversations, there is an actual height limit within the district. So I'm not sure exactly where the 28 feet came from. I'm presuming it's related to the sort of general height of the existing historic structures. But one thing here, one recommendation I hear is that I have here is that the accessory structure standards here are out of sync with Chapter 34 in the code, which governs accessory structures, and that generally speaking, two-story accessory structures are typically not really allowed in the code right now, and that one-story accessory structures, there's already a 15-foot height limit here. So I wasn't sure how the purpose of these standards here, but I thought the idea here would just be to defer to the existing accessory structure standards, which are more they're stricter than these here. However, I'm curious about the board's thought and your experiences with accessory structures in the district.
When you're talking about accessory structure, does that include a garage or a
Yeah, so garages are it's garages, accessory dwelling units, sheds, gazebos, things like that. So
we have a number of, I mean, well, technically they're 1.5 story, but I don't know if that counts as a 1 story or a 2 story within chapter 34.
Mhm.
We have a number of 1.5 story buildings and ones that have, sorry, garages that are 1.5 story that have a, a living area or a room above the garage.
Mhm.
And then we actually have a few that are actually 2 story. I mean, they have a room and then a full another story above the, a dormer above that
Yeah.
even.
Okay.
I can think of at least 3, and one has been approved by the board in the last 2 years.
Okay. So
But I don't know if that still doesn't
Yeah.
makes it different than chapter 34.
Okay. Let me do some more research on this then. So
And I don't know if that's the nature of the historic district, because the fact that we have such tiny lots that some of the homeowners are trying to just get more space out of what we have existing. And
Mhm.
there is some historic, I mean, some of the barns and other things are 1.5 stories, and some of them are 2 story barns that we already have, and those were historic. So
Yeah.
we kind of have a history of them already having a history of these 2 story buildings. And by a 1.5, isn't that's when the second floor is as a pitch roof, right, around it. That's a,
Mhm.
make sure I'm using my terms right.
So why don't I revisit this, and because I'm thinking I sense ambiguity here in how this standard relates to chapter 34. So so let me do that.
And I always get nervous that if we change that, does that mean if an existing structure that's historic, that's 2 stories or 1.5 story,
Mhm.
if it falls or gets damaged or burns, can we not replace it?
No, there are provisions in the non-conforming
Okay.
chapter for non-conforming structures. So yeah, generally speaking. But it sounds like the board's desire is to maintain that existing design pattern within the district. So
I mean, I personally want to simplify things and have things, be in harmony. So I would lean towards this change that you've got suggested here.
okay. So I think we could either entirely defer to chapter 34, and I could give an analysis of that, or we could perhaps clarify that different standards apply within the district, and we could state that explicitly. But I feel there's some ambiguity here as to how these standards relate to the general standards for accessory buildings such as garages and sheds and ADUs. So if the board's okay with it, it may be good for us to propose some clarifying language
Okay.
on that. So
Yeah, and one thing we want to be, I guess, mindful of is like the planning commission is trying to make it so ADUs will be cheaper to build, because
yes.
there's like an initial fee that's I think it's like 12K or something like that, some big number, and make it really off-putting. And we're trying to get that number reduced or eliminated, and so that could open that gateway for a lot of ADU construction. So we
Okay.
want to be mindful of that. The other thing, just to throw this out, is that with the new the HRB,
Mhm.
HRB, the housing bills of 2001, 2003.
Mhm.
Those are those could come into play. I brought it up with the planning commission that they were going to say 100% of the city is fair game, and I proposed. I'm not sure if it was really absorbed, but I proposed that if there's to be any protected part of the city, it would be the historic districts.
Okay.
And so, yeah. So I'm not sure if we want to legally look at how our rules and regulations interplay 2001 and 2003. I just figured, you know, we want to be on top of that stuff before it really takes hold.
Okay, that's that point's well taken. I'm aware of those changes coming down the pipeline, and I think I can address that in the next standard. We can talk about that. So
Well, then I wonder if that supports us maintaining difference from Chapter 34 and just securing the fact that we want to be a little different, that we still have our differences.
Yeah, I was in those meetings as well, on both of those, the 2000, 2003, and it does seem like we'll be set apart. The historic districts and everything will be set apart. There's different zones that have been identified for those development opportunities. And the public feedback, I think, was what, you know, members of this board might want, which is, you know, we'll increase housing capacity, but do it in a way that creates, you know, local character and, you know, the kind of the duplexes and cottage clusters that are in sync with the neighborhood was more warmly received than, you know, the mega apartment buildings and things like that. So, you know, it's definitely going to be an adjustment in general across the state and in our city, but I do think that we're riding the wave the right way. I'm feeling pretty good about it.
okay. So I think just also I can't speak specifically to the exemption for historic areas generally. I do think the comment about ADUs by Scott was good in terms of this could be a way to allow new housing into the district without changing the character too much, maybe as a way of sort of minimizing some of those impacts. But I'll be mindful about including some of that in the next draft that comes out in terms of how this will interplay with those sections. I'm sorry, with those other changes coming down the pipeline.
And John, I would be curious to see this 28 feet height that you noted. Looks like Darren must have noted it. I don't know how that came about, and I'd be curious to see where that came up. If that's the maximum height of any of the neighbors' houses. I'm actually looking across the street at our neighbor's house because I think it's taller than that.
So, yeah. So I think so right now the base zoning allows 35 maximum. At some point in the past, 28 was established as a limit within the district itself. So I can try and discover the origin of that, but it may be lost to time.
Yeah.
So,
for some reason, I feel like we have, as a board, already approved taller than that.
Okay.
For some reason, I feel like 36 was one that we approved recently.
Okay. So so that's something the board could obviously get rid of. It may also be a way of keeping structures smaller. It's a clear and objective standard. So and so maybe this is maybe we can find some examples of 28 versus 35 feet in terms of what you can fit inside those heights. So.
Or if we have existing structures in town that are all in the historic district that are 35 or above, it makes kind of a rethink about that.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. So I will do some research on that and try and find some examples. So I think that's about it for chapter 25. The remaining sections are not recommended for modification. So that would be the modification to design standards process, the designation process, the removal of a designation, and then demolition of a resource as well. All those are proposed are at this time are not proposed for change, though this demolition section may be expanded based upon the earlier conversation we had about demolition during construction. So, and this would likely be the section to insert that language about that, or to perhaps have a new section specifically addressing protection of the resource during construction. So, So I think that's it for that chapter. Any other questions about that chapter before we move on to chapter 58 in the Willamette Falls Design District? Okay, so moving on to that. I'll zoom in here a little bit to make it easier just for the viewing audience. So, so this chapter's already been discussed a few times, most recently in May. So I'm going to sort of focus in on some of the changes from last time, but I'm happy to revisit any section you want to come back to. So let's see here. So I think one question was, there was conversation in the past about defining this Western false front style. We talked about that earlier in the meeting about including a date range and specifying American West and not the Western Hemisphere or Western whatever. So so I think we've sort of addressed that. Are there any other thoughts about the definition in light of the context here? So okay, so hearing none, I'll move on, but happy to come back. So I think this, go ahead. Okay, so I think this page here, there are a number of changes on let's see here. That's my paper notes. See, on page 6 is where there are a fair number of changes compared to last time. So I think in terms of building materials, there was, as I recall the conversation, the decision was to specify wood, wood siding, and everything else had to go through a design exception. And so there's back and forth as to whether or not to allow things like hardy plank by right, because there are questions about grade and pattern and how do you define that. So the language here proposed would be horizontal wood siding in 1" by 8" dimensions shall be used. Brick and other materials are permitted only by a design exception. So I'm curious if this is consistent with our past conversations on that.
So, I mean, at this point in the downtown area, what percentage of buildings are actually still wood in the commercial district?
That's a good question. I haven't inventoried that, but I know there have been some. I know some buildings were authorized without wood. So, but
walking around, I think most, at least 50%, maybe more, is not even wood anymore. And I mean, that's fine if that's how we want to do things, but I think we should just kind of be honest about it, that in the commercial space, wanting businesses to occupy, like, we should, potentially look at maybe the design less than the material in that space if we've already kind of let the cat out of the bag in that district anyway.
Yeah,
I could see the standards being different for homes versus commercial, hence the two different codes.
Oh.
What do you guys think?
Well, I raised my concerns about the quality of hardy plank, and I definitely want to make sure, as long as we're keeping it in as a material for us to review, and not just blindly say, oh, it's hardy plank, okay, that's great, and then it goes up and we're like, that looks like vinyl,
Yeah. So yeah, we'll be having a lot of reviews, but that's fine.
Yeah,
That's how we stay relevant.
Why not, Scott?
Yeah.
No, that's fair. That's fair. I just wanted to comment on that because percentage-wise, you know, there's more hardy plank out there, but I think us having a look at it and making sure that it's legit and up to snuff is good.
Yeah. Okay, and there are some opportunities for some redevelopment to happen. So I think it'll be relevant. So, okay, so it sounds like this language is acceptable. Or at least this first draft is acceptable. So I think moving on down, I'm still having conversations with Public Works about the existing posts in the out there. I've walked the street. There are only 2 buildings that actually have existing posts there. I know new permits would be required to replace those, but from what I understand, Public Works do not make them. So far, you know, their initial response would be that they wouldn't have to completely redesign, but I'm still working with them on a scenario where, you know, what would happen if the post could not be replaced for one reason or another. But really, you know, by removing this standard to deny future use of wood post to support awnings isn't really going to affect too many buildings in downtown. So I guess what I'm trying to say is I have more to report back in the future on this. And then let's see here. So I think, and then generally awning section, I'll be coming back next time to talk more about that. So I think moving down through sections, I think we talked about planters last time. I think the HRB decided to remove the prohibition on planters since the cat was out of the bag somewhat, and that I think some people thought that was a desirable addition. So, and enforcement could be tricky. So
And there's already a lot of planters out there.
Yeah, correct. So what I heard was remove the standard. And so and then under paint colors, this would just follow up. So I think at the time agreement was the applicant should submit paint colors, only because if we specify paint colors, color palettes change from the manufacturers, things like that. So I think this language is based upon our prior conversation in May. And then there's also language about colors shall be similar to or consistent with existing buildings within the Willamette Commercial District to establish streetscape continuity.
I'm curious on the removal of it. Why are we removing the contrasting colors should be compatible? Is there a reason why that?
People got bad taste. You know, we're here to say
yeah. Yeah, no, I agree.
We want the contrasting colors to be clashing?
Yeah, I don't recall exactly. I recall I'd have to go back in terms of that. So if you want to, I can mark this for revisitation.
Just that, it was just that one line. I'm just wondering why we don't want to encourage them to be compatible.
Yeah.
Or at least I mean, actually that would be required, not even encouraging, that'd be requiring them to be compatible.
Yeah.
Because the word compatible is vague anyway, but it's at least to tell them that we want them to be somewhat matchy.
Yeah, yeah. So I don't recall. I remember having the conversation. I'll have to go back and double check on that. So so I have it marked to revisit and address specifically next time. And I think moving on here, the next major changes are to the design exception procedures. So there's one new standard and one clarification. So right now there are only 2 cases.
John, actually, before you move out, really quick, this is just
sure.
So if we remove number 25, the planters, and we remove number 27, do we move all the numbers up?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. The numbers will be redone during codification, and so I think, yeah, so that will just get renumbered appropriately.
Okay.
So
It doesn't just say like 27, removed. Okay.
no, we could do that too, but I think I mean, no, I think the standard would be just to renumber it appropriately.
Okay, good.
And so, yeah, we would also double check for any cross references at the same time.
Oh, yeah.
It just at this time we're trying to focus on content, but we'll definitely, yeah, we won't leave some numbers hanging. So, so I think in terms of that, I think the design exception procedure, since other changes earlier in this section were focused on removing ambiguity, it's going to push some applications into the design exception process. So I thought to clarify one of the existing paths for an exemption, and to create a new one that we touched upon briefly at the last meeting. So I think one is to clarify the use of non-period materials, and so I thought criterion B would be the appropriate place to address it, where basically if someone wanted to use non-period materials, we place within the section that says the applicant is incorporating exceptional 1880 to 1915 architecture into the building, which overcompensates for an emission, deviation, or use of non-period materials. And the emphasis is upon superior design, detail, or workmanship. So, so perhaps if you want to use non-period materials, you would have to make up for it through through exceptional design. And this is a somewhat discretionary standard. So, but it's sort of a first pass at a possible criterion. If you wanted to maybe break it out a different way, we could do that. I just wanted to put this out there. So I guess the thing is, when go ahead.
I was just gonna say I like that approach.
Mm-hmm.
So okay, and then so I think the trade-off is that you get to deviate, but the public has to receive a higher quality outcome as a result on balance. The new criterion goes back to something we touched upon last meeting, is that there are really 3 sites in the district that are good candidates for redevelopment. I'm sorry, for revitalization without a full scrape and redevelopment path. And so, and either they have exceptional architecture in their own right, or they're just, they aren't quite to the point of being ready to be demolished. And those are, it's the old gas station site, the apartments on the other side of the street from them, and then on the other end of downtown is the youth music project. None of those buildings really lend themselves to easy conversion to an 1880 to 1915 Western false front architecture. There is a scenario perhaps where the gas station has architectural merits in its own right, worthy of preservation. And most recently, when the youth music project went through on a number of years ago, quite a few variances were granted, to sort of allow the latest redesign of that building. And it's angled orientation and mid-century design just don't play well with the Western false front architecture. So the idea here would be to create a sort of discretionary path for someone to restore or alter an existing out of period structure. And the standard, the applicant would have to demonstrate that they cannot reasonably comply with the standards due to existing building setbacks, orientation, roof forms, materials, functional design, or other existing conditions. And where the exception would continue to further the purposes of the chapter. So, I've crafted the language to where it would only apply to the restoration or alteration, and not to the full demolition and redevelopment of the site. And
Does
just to, go
that
ahead.
give them or grant them permission then just to do whatever they want without variances, or does that just give them permission that give us a way to do it?
It gives them a way to do it, and they still have to follow the purposes of the chapter. And this is like a first pass of the language, but I just wanted to sort of come back up to the purpose statement here, and they would have to make findings against this. So you would have to contribute to the rehabilitation and revitalization of the commercial district. You would have to enhance the aesthetic quality of the commercial district, historic and aesthetic quality, increase the attractiveness of the commercial area. I mean, this one could be a little difficult. Reinforce the commitment to existing commercial buildings of the 1880 to 1915 period, and also encourage a sense of historic identity. So it would, any sort of redesign or sort of spiffing up would have to make findings about to these items here, or at least not conflict with these goals. But I think I kind of wanted to check in with the board on sort of what circumstances you see this being allowed. I think the most current example, the most pressing example, is the old gas station site, which has a sort of mid-century vibe to it that the current owners are hoping to revive. And so, however, the youth music project could come in again in the future for some sort of upgrade or expansion, and the apartment buildings may or may not at some point want to be spiffed up, and trying to convert those to a false front style could be awkward. So in that case, I'm just curious about the board's thoughts to this rough draft. So
On the surface, I don't see a problem with it. One thing it does make me think about, though, that's not addressed in here or anywhere else, and we've had these conversations, but it's never been reflected in any of the changes, is that there are a number of period appropriate homes on that street that are not ever addressed in here because they're not commercial structures, and now they are, but they were not traditional commercial structures of the 1880s to 1915. But they're technically not being protected, and that's actually one of the, we've had this conversation. There's those three bungalows or two bungalows that are right next to each other with a lot in between that are basically zoned for demolition, even though they're right. I mean, because they are not Western false fronts, they're not on zero lot line. Yet they are historic, and they do leave the historic identity of the Willamette area and Weston as a whole, but they're not in any way protected under Chapter 25 or 58 in any way. And that's the way that wording there doesn't necessarily apply to these guys.
So as I recall, I believe those are already exempted elsewhere in the chapter. Let me pull up that.
I thought they weren't, but I could be wrong.
So let me do. So under exemptions to this chapter, so yeah, remodels to exclusive single family residential homes are exempt. So,
but what if they're no longer single family residential homes and they're being instead used for commercial?
Correct. So yeah, single family homes that are used for businesses or home occupations are not exempt. So I see your point here in terms of there's no standards here that really address.
In fact, really, we actually could even take that out because there are no single family residential homes in that section that's being affected by 58 that I know of. I think maybe by the church there is. Maybe there's, but actually that's also retail. I mean, commercial. There may be one in there. There may be one in the entire district, but otherwise, all the homes that are in there are being used for law offices or law offices.
Well, I think some of these standards would apply, such as the siding, for example, and whatnot. I think so. So I guess going back, I guess your concern is similar to these other to these other non-single family buildings. The standards don't. The Western false front style doesn't lend itself easily to the bungalows, basically. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, and it's a bigger question that I would love to throw into chapter 58 that I've heard from many of the neighbors, that we have these cute little bungalows
Mhm.
right next adjacent to empty lots. Both of those ones on the north side of the street over by the Willamette Cider and Ale House. Those are prime real estate to get bulldozed and put into a big giant western facade front there, and they're not protected because there's empty lots between them. There's
Yeah.
and I think the neighborhood would not want those to be gone.
Mhm.
We'd want to protect it, as well as on the other side where the Ellickson house, and there's nothing protecting that house at all either. And depending on how you interpret the code, it almost encourages builders and contractors to bulldoze those homes.
Yeah,
And
that does seem to be the overall intent or result of the current standards, is to create that commercial streetscape
right.
of new two-story false front structures.
Yeah. Which, I mean, if anyone knows the history of the 1880s and 1915s, most main streets had that kind of, there was a house, and then there's the grocer, and then there's the butcher, and then there was a house. And that is actually that is much more the streetscape than a solid, continuous false front the entire, at least for a small town. Actually, even in Manhattan, they still have that. You still have that, Italianate front, and then there's a little house, and then Italianate front, of course they were Italianate, not Western false front, but
Yeah.
I think if we brought this to the neighborhood, I know they would want to be able to protect those. And there's been lots of conversations about making sure that we have something in code to keep those from becoming, gigantic big buildings. And especially that really came up a few years ago. I don't know if the board even knew about this, but there was the lot between the two bungalows was sold, and they actually got permission to build something on there. Although the owners of it wanted to build a matching bungalow to go along with those to make 3 bungalows in a row, but they were not allowed to. They had to do a 0 lot line design, and they were so upset they never built it, luckily. But it was zoned and it was passed and it was approved. And I don't know, John, how long are the approvals good for? I'm not sure if it still is approved or not.
3 years, I believe.
So it might be, it's probably outside that now. So they probably have to just look at it reapproved.
Yeah.
But I think it'd be something that would be great for the board to discuss and bring to council to find out if there's a way that we can save that look and feel, because it sure is nice to have that little grass scape and those little yards and the little things, even though it's a law office or, I don't even know what's in all of them. I think one of them has a yoga place but that is not addressed in chapter 55, 58, and that would probably need to be some kind of addition.
Yeah, I mean, that is a good point, Danny, because, we're talking about the music school and places that are, outside of these design standards. So, you're basically getting ahead of a future problem that could happen again in that regards,
Well, and it will, because there is a big lot there that's for sale, and it just kind of lends itself, as well as where the new Icon building right adjacent to it. There's a 1907 building on the corner of Willamette Falls Drive and 12th that would not be protected.
Yeah.
And it's a cute little law office right now, but and it's not. It is a single family home, but it's not being used that way. So therefore, it's no longer exempt.
Yeah. Okay, well, this is something that we can do some internal staff review about maybe some options to kind of to sort of talk about next time in terms of this. And then I can do a little bit of research about that existing approval as well.
Yeah, and I think my argument for it would be, if we look at our purpose and we look at letter E of it, is to encourage the historic and identity of the Willamette area and West Linn as a whole. I think bulldozing those and putting in more, I don't want to be derogatory to Icon, but those icon-shaped buildings, those Western facade fronts, which are gorgeous buildings, but to destroy a piece of history, to replace it with that, breaks the intention of protecting the historic identity of the area. Yet we don't have any hooks in here to keep that from happening, preventing that. As well, I mean, there's not even anything in the code in chapter 58 about demolition. That's not even mentioned in here.
Yeah.
to protect those and when at what point they can demolish.
Yeah, I mean, that might be the approach to take, is to have a section in there about that.
Okay.
Because we do have some pretty strict guidelines in chapter 25 about what they can and can't demolish, but it's not mentioned in 58 at all.
Yeah, the purpose here is slightly different, so but yeah, I see what you're striving towards on this. Okay, well, I think it might be helpful if we came up, if staff worked on maybe some possible options, or possible recommendation options, I should say, to advance forward. And
again, I hate to go back to it, but there are historic districts in other cities nearby. Like I'm thinking like Sherwood and Newburgh and some of those others where they have that same kind of thing, where there's a bunch of historic commercial buildings and then there's a house, which is usually now, I keep going back to law, insurance building or something, and then a bunch of commercial buildings. So there's got to be some examples, and maybe we could see some wordage from verbiage of how others have used and maintained that.
Yeah, it's fairly common to have those buildings converted to commercial use, and so other cities have likely solved this problem in one way or another, or come up with a policy direction that works for them. So,
and I think that chapter 58 was intending it by saying the terms, protect, single family houses are exempt. But what happens as soon as it's no longer a single family home? As soon as it's a commercial building.
Yeah, it looks like the policy was to protect residential uses and not commercial. So but
and I think at least my definition of it is, I don't think the use of it is what matters. I think the structure is what matters, not whether it's being used for commercial, retail, or restaurant, or a B&B or whatever. It should still be protected because of the structure and the nature of the structure. But I'll get off my Apple box. Sorry.
Okay. Any other thoughts or comments on this section by other members? Or is that it?
I think there was another conversation. I know Tom probably would have mentioned this if he was here, but he had mentioned it before, that when the city started doing all these streetscape changes, that, and actually it was even before him, Jerry offered many years ago, was concerned that the city was doing streetscape changes that never got approved by the Historic Review Board, even though Chapter 58 has it in there that certain things need to be approved by us. And there was no approval process or even application by the city or anything. And I don't know if there's a way to put teeth into that, but I know Jerry was very much in arms. A lot of these little just things. I know we have. I can't remember what it is, but we have the jurisdiction over. I think it was features of the street, is the way it was mentioned. Yet we had no say in any of those things when it happened. We had no thing. I don't know if there's a way to put any kind of more clarification that even if it's a city change and they want to put in things like, mailboxes, and actually I think it does may or may not say mailbox. I have to go back there. But those are areas that we are supposed to have jurisdiction over for approval. Yet it was railroaded right through. We had no approval whatsoever on that streetscape on Willamette Falls Drive. And I have had many, many residents.
Yeah, we would have stopped that. I was going to say, we would have stopped that back in parking thing.
Yeah.
You come up with your horse, head first, you tie him to the post. That's.
Well,
you don't tie the rear end in there.
And I don't know if that's outside of our jurisdiction. I think the jurisdiction says that we have for furnishings or something like that. I have to go find the code, but it says something like that all the fixtures, which they now have these non-historic weird ball bike racks that we should have absolutely had say over, which we did not. And I've had many of the neighbors knocking on my door, well, not knocking on my door, but approaching me at the at the fair saying, why in the world did that happen? And
Yeah.
we didn't have a vote on that at all.
Well, I will take a look. If you find that section, could you just drop me a note? It can be in an email. I can look into that and report back. And so,
Yeah, it was brought to my attention by Jerry Offer. Jerry is the former chairman of the board, and I know he wanted, before his departure, was very concerned about that because that was when that whole streetscape was being approved and we had no say. And I know we approached it to John Calvert and he just said, well, we're doing this. But I'll ask Jerry where the code was. I don't remember. I have to go dig back through it again.
yeah, that'd be helpful just to have, and I can do some reporting back on that. So, okay. So I think that those were all the changes I had to report today with that. So I think, let's see here. Any other thoughts or comments or concerns the board wanted to raise on this before we wrap up the latest session of code revisions? I believe you're muted, Commissioner. Or board member.
I'm not thinking. I think we're good to move on. Does anyone else have any?
Yeah.
No?
It clearly says I can press the space bar, but apparently I can't.
So,
No, I was just gonna say this, I thought this was an excellent review and touched on a number of things that brought back previous conversations to mind and stuff that, and I'm hoping that we're coming down the funnel along the way here.
yes.
Eventually this,
Yeah.
get this out and
So
make it manifest instead of a interesting discussion.
I agree. Hopefully at the next meeting in August, we can get to some final language, or at least enough to a point where you feel comfortable starting the process of getting this through a public hearing process. So I think we don't have to solve everything before we move into the public hearing phase, but it would be nice to get it wrapped up to a point next month to where everyone felt comfortable putting this out for publication. So before it starts getting a little more scrutiny and we enter into the formal hearings process. So, okay. So I think with that, I think we'll kind of close it for now. And if anyone has any additional thoughts in the meantime, feel free to drop me a note and I can report and we can follow up at the next meeting on that. But feel free to, since it's a workshop still, we're not in that hearings process, any additional thoughts or concerns are most welcome. So.
Good. Then I think we move on to item 5, which is items of interest from the board. Any of the board members have anything? I wanted to mention one thing. I know I was not at the last meeting, and I apologize, but I did watch the recording, and I wanted to at least mention one thing that I mentioned to Darren about the proposal of the change of the streets over by the old city hall.
Mm-hmm.
Is I was concerned, and it wasn't brought up by any of the board members, but I was concerned about the creation of an island around all of the historic section of town there.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know, John, if Darren had shared my email with you about that, but that was the reason why I had actually asked Darren to present that to the board, because some of the neighbors have already mentioned that all of those historic properties will now be fronted and backed by major roads, basically creating an island of property, as well as the city hall, which is now up for National Registry. And I think that is something that needs to be of concern for us as the board, because it certainly changes the integrity of the history of that area. Part of our mission and part of our directive is to protect the historic feel of the whole town, regardless of whether it's under Chapter 25 or 58. But that really changes those homes and properties around there. And it also changes the direction of traffic flow, which is also historic, obviously. by by destroying that area. So that was my one biggest concern about that new proposal, and I voiced that to Darren. We, as a board, need to be very careful about that area because I've seen in past proposals of that area where the history has been completely disregarded for progress, which I don't want to be the hysterical society, but I think we need to keep that in mind that when you start digging shovels into historic dirt, that things could happen. And then when they were doing the repairs over on Willamette Falls Drive, I actually had a couple of neighbors saying, "Is anyone checking archaeological digs?" And no one was checking for archaeology in that area. And if you start digging over in that mill, we will need to check for archaeology because there will be archaeology anytime you do streetscape. And that area is very, very old. It dates all the way back to the native tribes and before. So I think that needs to be noted and needs to be taken into the planning process, that there needs to be historic review, not by us necessarily, but by the city. If they're going to start putting shovels in the ground, that they need to realize that they could be bringing up native burials. They could be doing lots of stuff because that area has not been disturbed for over 100 years.
So I think the comments are duly noted, and I think the city's being conscious of that. One thing that was reported at the time, which I'm fairly confident came up at the meeting, but I don't recall it with precision, is that the odds are federal money is going to be used for this road. So a Section 106 review is going to happen, and so archaeological evaluations would be part of that process. And then PGE also has archaeologists on staff, and so they're familiar with the site, and they know, they have some familiarity with some of the potential resources, but duly noted about that. And so
although the problem with the state of Oregon code is that we actually discourage archaeological discovery, because as soon as you do, then all construction stops. So you're better just to bring the backhoe in and dig it up and pretend like you didn't find anything because it went in a dumpster than you are to do any research. Because if you happen to find an arrowhead and you get that arrowhead out of the ground, you got to stop all construction and bring in archaeologists. So that's one of the problems with Oregon's code. The Oregon state, law is that we don't actually, the law, while it's supposed to save history, it actually says, don't look, just dig. Because if you happen to find it, then you got to stop. And that's what happened on Willamette Falls Drive. They just backhoed everything into the dumpster, into the trucks, and took off. And who knows what was in there, if there was anything. But anyway. And then I'm also big concerned about what's going to happen to that neighborhood, because that neighborhood will lose its integrity of history. It's no longer going to be the same street that it was, for the last 100 years, because it's going to be now divided on both sides by major traffic. And I know it's not a lot. I don't think there's any. I can't say there's not, but I don't think there's a lot of homes in there. There might be one or two residents, but it's mostly businesses. But still, it changes the. I know the street will not physically impact them, but it will impact them by egress and ingress and noise and all of those things that they now have to deal with. Because right now they don't have to deal. It's only in the backyard. They're not putting a street in the front yard right now. There's obviously truck parking, but there's no heavy traffic going through there. And we are going to change that and put a major major road both through their front yard and their backyard. Maybe the commercial districts will like that, but I just don't want those houses being impacted more than they already are.
Okay.
But that's my only take on it. Sorry.
Yeah.
Okay. I was gonna say, I mean, I've only lived in town for 9 years, but that whole area, man, I shoot right past it. It's kind of hard to pay attention to it because if I do, I'm gonna drive off the road. I mean, it's just so. The thing that I like about the 43 redesign and then the Willamette Falls Drive redesign and how they're going to intersect through that area is it's going to encourage a lot more bicycle and pedestrian traffic. And that in turn is going to make it so people will actually see these historic structures and like maybe stop for a second and really appreciate them. I mean, with the Willamette Falls Drive redesign, I mean, it's still It's just 2 lanes. It's just they're adding bicycle and pedestrians. So yeah, it's going to be wider. But it's going to invite actual use of that space for something other than driving, over to Oregon City. I mean, sure, during the weekdays, there's probably going to be increased traffic, but then during the evenings and the weekends, I mean, I think it will still be some place to be enjoyed.
Except for, if you look at the design though, Scott, you got to look at the way they built it, is the bikes and the walking path will not be by those historic homes. It'll be on the other side, away from the homes. So they'll have to look through the traffic to see a house. And then they're going to go right into the roundabout, which if you've done any study on roundabouts, bicycles and roundabouts do not mix. It is the absolute most dangerous thing for a bicyclist to go across a roundabout, as well as pedestrians. So that's why most the civil engineers code does not suggest you put roundabouts near bike lanes or pedestrian lanes. They're actually mostly supposed to be out in the countryside where there's no bikes and no pedestrians, because there's not a safe way for a pedestrian or a bike to cross those, because they're not part of that traffic flow. It's very, very dangerous. So, and there's lots of studies on that. That's not just me making it up. You can go look up the studies on the roundabouts. While roundabouts are great, I love roundabouts. They are great ways to get vehicles through. They're very dangerous for pedestrians and for bicycles. And if you've ever tried to cross one, you can see why. I've done it up at Lesher Farms, where that roundabout is, up at Lesher Farms in Lake Oswego. That is scary. That is very scary to cross when you're just crossing the street. And that's a pretty slow roundabout because it's pretty small. But we're gonna have
Well,
two or
you got
three
all,
of them.
that's all commuter traffic flowing through there, and that's definitely the same thing we'll have happening down at 43 Willamette Falls Drive intersection. And that's definitely something that I can take to the planning committee to make sure that, I mean, because we did, this city staff initially like deprioritized a lot of the pedestrian and safety features, and we made sure that all of those got bumped up to high priorities for the budget to make sure, those don't get skimped out on. And I can definitely raise those concerns. When we look at the design again. When it starts getting more finalized, and I'll definitely do what I can to represent the HRB's perspective there, and to make sure that Darren and the planning commission are aware that it's like, well, we've got our eye on it too, and that we want to make sure that we're having our fair say in these things. It's just a concept plan though now, right? That's
Yeah.
one thing I saw with the roundabouts was that they were planning on doing a more urban style roundabout design. So these weren't going to be the ones with the mound in the middle with landscaping in them, because those can make it really hard to see oncoming traffic through the roundabout. And so I think these were meant to be higher visibility style roundabouts.
And the safety, obviously the safety part of it and that pedestrian part is not part of the HRB's area at all. I focused on the HRB concern of more of the historic, how do you have the city hall surrounded by roads on every side? If we want to make this National Registry property, we're going to have it literally have a road on almost every side of it now. It does not in the pitch of the city, and part of that whole proposal was to make this a center that can be used by people and can be a center point for the community with a mixed use. But if we've got a roundabout in front of it, a road on the left and a road on the right, makes it really hard to be a historic property that can be used for anything except for just sitting empty in the middle of a roundabout nearly. We signed off on the pitch, for the National Registry 3 months ago or whatever it was. And it seems that we're going to try to make it harder by putting a roundabout directly in front of it and the road beside it on both ends. There would be no place for any kind of parking at all, which there isn't right now anyway. I know the city doesn't own any parking. I know that's already part of the issue.
Parking's been negotiated already.
Yeah.
Has it?
And the other thing that's going to be interesting, that parking lot was all a village at the time for the Grand Ronde. So it'll be very interesting how they do that.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Yeah, because
that was a village site.
That'll be something for sure. That So
you've got good points there. The parking, which I don't know what the current executive director is doing. I know the last executive director had bills all set up with the mill and the mill's owner for parking in there. So how in the world is the building going to be functional without parking?
Yeah, I can't speak with certainty on this. I'm not the lead on this for the city, but I understand parking is being planned for and accommodated on that. And our consultant for the National Register nomination did take a look at the proposed changes and did not think it would negatively impact the historic status of the building. I think she said the primary relationships would still be maintained of the historic city hall with the bridge and some of the other commercial structures in the area, and that increased bike and pedestrian access would only help maintain that. So she didn't have any sort of initial thoughts, and I'm sorry, initial concerns about some of the road changes affecting the status of that structure. So I can't present her findings for her necessarily on this time, but her initial pass on that was that we would not have any problems meeting federal criteria. So during those changes, but your concerns were noted. So and I'll pass these along to Darren as this advances. And
yeah, I just have, I have the big red flag of what happened on Willamette Falls Drive. Once bitten, twice shy, and we were, yeah, a lot of the neighbors are not happy with it, and a lot of people actually said it did the exact opposite. It's destroyed the historic nature of the old street, where you can't even tell anymore where the trolley line used to run. It doesn't even look like a trolley ran there anymore, versus before with the little side things, you could kind of get a sense that might have been a trolley there, and now it just looks like a big parking lot. So yeah, I've heard it. I've been manning the Historical Society booth at the farmers market, and every Wednesday, one or two people wandered up and said, "Well, why did the Historical Society stop this?" I'm like, "We don't do that. We're not a lobby group. We're just here to tell the story. You got to go talk to the city." So I'm hearing it, not with AHRB hat. I'm actually hiding that when they come by. I don't tell them that I'm on that review board. But I know a lot of the citizens of the old timer citizens are just not happy that happened, and I'd hate to have that happen over there, and then we dig up the road, and as David said, who knows, we could find a whole village there, and that's going to stop that whole thing anyway.
okay.
Any other items of interest from the board? And actually, John, I had a question. What is the status then of the SHPO request for the National Registry? Where what the timing is on that?
I do actually have I have some updates on that actually. That was part of the staff update. So
awesome. Then we'll move over to that.
Okay. so I'm going to save that for last because it's probably the longest update I have. So the first item is I gave Tom a preview of this already, but since I talked to him when he called out, but next month we're actually returning to in-person meetings. So so I know. So I would love to meet you all in person, and so I'm looking forward to that. And we are moving to that. That said, it's going to be a hybrid approach. So there's new state legislation that the city has to comply with, and that I forget the exact list of meetings they have to comply, but because the HRB does quasi-judicial land use approvals, we have to run a hybrid meeting, which is both in person as well as accommodating people who want to participate remotely. And so we're still working out the details. Every city is trying to figure out how this is going to work, but basically the board will meet in person, but yet we'll have an active stream and a mechanism for people to participate from home. And because it might be awkward doing it one way during a hearing and another way during a workshop, it might just be easier if we just, do it consistently for every meeting. So I don't have a precise a list of operating procedures yet. So we're working on that. But basically, the next meeting is going to be in person, and members of the public who want to participate can sign up and participate remotely. So plan for that at our next meeting, which is going to be, I believe it's the 17th. Yes, August 17th. So,
So
and
we'll be back in chambers, or the City Hall chambers, or where?
we're going to be in the Bolton room during workshops and then up in the chambers during the hearing. It's just easier if everyone sits around the table and can hammer things out during a workshop. So if you do have an item to consider, and eventually the McLean House application will come before you. That's to add a permanent shelter in the back of the property. They have weddings and things there. That's eventually coming before you, but that's still under review. But we'll be in the Bolton room here at City Hall. So that's the first item, unless there are questions about that. The second item, just a reminder that the National Association of Preservation Commissioners is having a series of like online classes next month. So I have one member interested in attending. I'm just double checking to see if anyone else has interest. Just want to put that reminder out there. I can resend the email. But it's just sort of 6 classes on preservation practice from the perspective of a historic review board member. So, and then the third item is historic City Hall. So going to my notes here, on June 18th, the State Advisory Committee on Historic Preservation reviewed and recommended that they reviewed and recommended approval of the Historic City Hall nomination to the National Register. They did request more information before they finalized the approval. So our consultant is working on that. She has until August 2nd to provide the additional information. I don't know if she's submitted that already, but she's on track to complete that application. Once that's done, the state will forward that on to the National Park Service, and then they have 45 days to render their decision. So we're looking at action probably around October sometime. And now with COVID and everything else going on, that who knows? But so we're looking at if sort of final action by October. Everything seems to be tracking well for approval. Once that happens, we're definitely going to have a sort of celebration ceremony, and the HRB will be invited, and we have some ideas about how to perhaps do that. But keep that on your radar for the fall, is that if we get the approval, we definitely want to share that with the community. So that's the update on that. So
John, do you know what the items they asked for from the consultant? I'm just curious.
I remember I heard them once. I don't recall offhand. I think they wanted some additional information bolstering some of the findings about the history of the structure. I don't recall offhand. I can follow up on that if you want. I just slipped out my brain. It's 8 o'clock, so
I was just more curious.
8:30.
I don't think it does make a difference, but
yeah, I don't think there were any concerns. I think they just wanted some sections strengthened, and so that they probably anticipated questions from the Park Service and wanted to firm up some of the conclusions. And that's, I believe it was, I could be wrong, but I believe it may have been related to some of the commercial activity in the building on the ground floor. But again, I'm not 100% certain on that. So, but otherwise, that's tracking well right now. So,
perfect.
okay. And I think that's about it. No other new land use applications. Just the McLean House, as I mentioned earlier. We've had one preliminary investigation about an ADU on a historic property on Willamette Drive, but that died after we had a pre-application meeting, and they had some pretty substantial frontage improvements they had to take care of. And so that's where killed that for now. Staff is revisiting requiring frontage improvements for ADUs, and so that's something that's in progress. But for now, that project has died, according to the homeowner, just the cost factor. I'm trying to think if there's anything else.
What about the status on the gas station permit?
So that we understand the new owners have taken control of the property. We are checking with them actually. So we haven't heard anything recently. So I think now that they're actually in control, they're probably trying to firm up contracts. But we're hoping on that. We actually met today to talk about food carts this afternoon amongst ourselves. So staff is working on that, on finalizing our interpretation about what standards will apply. But that's about it so far. So we will keep
Will
you
they have to
posted on
take it
that.
through a class 2 design review?
They will. So at this point, their intention is to get a few carts on site to get started, and then come back for a class 2 design review to sort of fix up the structure. And so, and depending upon the timing of the application, the revised code edits may apply at that time. So I believe that's more of a spring application for them. And so I think right now they want to activate the site and get some carts going with some pretty minimal improvements, just carts, sewer hookups. That's about it. A very minimal launch at that point.
So they don't need any kind of review at all or any kind of approval for an actual physical temporary structure like a cart at all.
So so a cart technically is not a structure. It's actually a vehicle. So it's they aren't proposing any new structures or alterations to the existing buildings. They're literally parking a vehicle and opening up. So that's the plan on that. And so but so things like ADA upgrades to the bathrooms, things like that, we'll have a full review by the HRB. So that's, but I think they're looking to try and activate it first and then come in for their full vision.
Interesting.
Yeah, so that's coming down the pipeline. So.
Does the city have code that guides the permanent parking of a commercial vehicle?
So in terms of that, the parking code does not apply within the Willamette Falls Design District. So
Right.
parking required. In terms of that, the state so there are state regulations for food carts which are enforced by local public health departments. So the carts are licensed by Clackamas or Multnomah County, wherever they overnight is where they would be licensed through. And through that, part of the state requirements for food carts is that they have to be self-contained. They have to remain on wheels and be mobile at any time. Any awnings or things like that have to be attached to the cart, and they can't be reliant upon ground-based sort of awnings or supports or things like that. So they really have to maintain a mobile nature. Now, some carts get parked there for you look around the region, they don't move very often, but they have to be capable of being moved. So
I'm interested to hear from the board. I don't know if we can push this discussion until next time, but I would love to talk to the board about thoughts on changing Chapter 58 to address temporary parking structures like that, because there's a number of spots where you could actually fill them with parking. I mean, the gas station fits perfectly because it's on the outside of the district, but there are some areas that if that's a success, I could actually see a number of food carts popping up along Willamette Falls Drive. And if I'm wondering if that maintains what Chapter 58 wants in its integrity of the historic district, maintaining its historic look with a bunch of greasy food carts running along it. But we have no jurisdiction at this point to do anything about it.
So at this point, it's sort of treated like a cart, and the gas station is unique and that already has that parking field. So but if the board wanted to discuss this, we could set this up for next time.
I would like to at least discuss it. Maybe I'm the only one on it, but I'm trying to wonder. Right now there actually are a couple of carts that are parking fairly consistently over by some of the stores, and it certainly takes away the historic identity of Willamette area to have these carts there. But maybe I'm wondering if we're going to be playing with Chapter 58, that we throw something in there talking about permanent, what do you call it? Temporary permanent vehicle parking.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree, Danny. I think you got to get out ahead of that.
And again, that gas station's a nightmare anyway for our code as it is. So, but I'm just thinking there's a couple of other parking structures that actually work for it. And one of them actually is the cider house. They've been parking food trucks along the side of them fairly consistently, not just during farmers market, but I don't know. Yeah, I'd like to have that discussion. Can we push that forward to next time then? If everyone's okay with that.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a lengthy conversation.
Yeah.
Okay. We can certainly do that. I think just as a thought process here, I think food carts do reflect areas high in activity and they sort of drive activity. So from a sort of activity level, it does sort of support the downtown, I guess the Main Street area as being a sort of vibrant place. So there are some positive aspects to that. But I think we can talk about the regulatory landscape at next month as a discussion item. So
I mean, I think what it goes back to is our goal, our charter as proposed in the purpose is not to add to the business. We're supposed to encourage a sense of identity, increase attractiveness for the commercial area, enhance historic and aesthetic qualities. That's really our goal, and I know that's completely at odds with the Historic Willamette. That organization, Historic Willamette, wants to drive business. And a lot of our code in Chapter 58 does not drive business. Actually, it's somewhat kind of limiting business on what they can do. And I think that's probably that balance that we have. I mean, we don't have to play that balance. We are completely on the historic side. That's supposed to be our job. And then, it's up to other people to make the argument. And personally, I love the idea of food carts, but I just want to make sure that we've got, some of it thinking about, because I know I live right behind the commercial district. I get those greasy runoff from these stores. They drip down all the neighborhood. And if we put in a dozen food carts, you're going to have that times 12 all around that neighbors. And, besides the fact that if you've ever looked in downtown, there's constant explosions and gas leaks and carts going up in flames. Do a Google search on food cart fire in Portland, and there's a lot of them.
Yeah. I think there are some definite unique issues there. I think one thing to mention is that the city code does require hookups to sewer service. So I think some of the concerns related to sort of gray water and sort of grease and whatnot will be addressed by other aspects of the city code. So just a thought there. And then I think TVF&R also has jurisdictional, but I am very familiar with some of those explosions and other issues downtown, and in my previous life I've worked with food carts in other places, so not as an employee, but in regulating them. So I think it's they have their own unique challenges along with their own benefits.
Sure.
So
but again, if we're looking at the historic aesthetics, that's what I get wondering, like, how do we phrase that and say, well, ye old food cart or something, I don't know.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we could definitely talk about that next time. I don't want to take anyone else's time. Any other items from the board or from staff?
None for me.
I'll just let you know, I will not be available for the August meeting.
Oh, John, actually, I do have a question for the remote. If we're doing it remotely, is there a way, if someone is out of town, to remotely connect back in then as a board member?
I think we could do that. It's not always ideal, but it's better to have some participation than not. I think hybrid reality, hybrid life is something we're all trying to adjust to. So I think that would benefit. I mean, even years ago, I've seen plenty of commissioners and city council members remote in. So I think it's something we could do. I think the desire would be in person as much as possible, but I think we could certainly accommodate a hybrid model. So
and since we all know how to use WebEx now, we have no excuse.
Exactly.
Well, I work out at Wilsonville High School, where we've been doing hybrid for 3 months. So
yeah,
with the students, so very familiar with some of the challenges of doing that.
Yeah.
But that's a possibility.
Yeah.
Plug in through hybrid.
I think it'll be complicated, but in the end, if it increases participation, I think it's a good thing. So it's just, but the devil's always in the detail. So
And we have our YouTube followers. So we need to
yes,
think about our YouTube followers. So we need to make sure we give them their content. But
absolutely.